Hello, sociologists. Welcome back. This is Ethnicity, lesson number 10. Look at that freak with all his rings. Okay, our learning goals for today are: I want you to know how Australia compares to other countries in terms of multiculturalism, yeah? Every country's a little bit multicultural. How multicultural is our country? I want you to know what makes a multicultural policy successful. So how would you decide whether a multicultural policy is doing well? I want you to know how successful Australian multiculturalism is. So then it's not quite the same as number one. Number one is how multicultural are we? Number two is what makes multicultural policy successful. And number three is, well, based on what makes a multicultural policy successful, how successful is Australia? And I also want you to be able to interpret graphs and infographics. So I'm going to show you a whole heap of graphs, maps, and infographics, and you're going to have to write a couple of sentences interpreting them. Right on. Okay, so Australia's ethnic diversity compared internationally. What have we got here? It's got the ninth highest population of international migrants in the world. Now, I think I showed you a chart in an earlier lesson that said that it was the third highest, so forget that. It's ninth. I've got another graph. It must have gone down the ranking. It's the internet. You can find whatever you want on there. And in Australia, migrants have the same rights as citizens born here. Now, that might seem like a weird thing to say. You'd assume that's quite obvious, but it's not actually obvious. That's not true for all countries. I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah, so one place I've travelled to, Tonga. In Tonga, if you're not Tongan, you're not allowed to own property. Like land, you can only own up to 49% share in it. So you couldn't own a block of land, you'd have to go halves with a local. And Tonga does that so that foreigners don't buy up all their land. In Australia, 28% of people here are born overseas, and that's quite high. That's a long-standing trend, yeah, that's been true for centuries. Does this highlight the success of Australia's multicultural policy? I would argue yes, it does. Yeah, if there's that many migrants coming here, then obviously Australia's multicultural policy must be good. If migrants, when they travelled to Australia, were treated really badly, couldn't get work, and blah blah blah, and suffered heaps of racism, then you wouldn't see lots of migrants moving to Australia. Yeah, Australia's a rich, successful country. We're very lucky to be here. So yeah, I think Australia's multicultural policy is successful. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of graphs and maps here. This one here is interesting. I don't have the key for it, so I can't remember exactly what's going on. It's a migration map, so all the little arrows show you where people migrate from and to, and in blue is people going to that place, and red is people leaving that place. Yeah, so have a look on the left there. You see that heaps of Central American countries have heaps of migrants moving to the US. There's heaps of internal migration in Europe, quite a few migrants going from North Africa to Europe. There's a lot of migration going on in the Middle East, and quite a bit of internal migration going on in Africa. There's heaps of southern African countries moving to the country called South Africa. And you can also see the big one-way migration traffic from New Zealand to Australia, although that has slowed a lot in recent years. This one here, similar graph to the other one. So, in light brown are traditional centres of migration. Yeah, so Australia's been a traditional centre of migration to Australia for ages. And the darkest brown are new centres of migration growth. Yeah, so people are now starting to move to South Africa, to Japan, to Eastern Europe, and whatever. I find that one a bit confusing. Anyway, check this one out. This is the 15 countries with the most migrants in millions. This is not taking into account the percentage. Yeah, the percentage is in grey on the left, but just purely in terms of millions of migrants, that's how many. So the US has got 48 million foreign-born people, and so on. So Australia comes out ninth in the number of migrants in millions, but it's higher than that in terms of the percentage. If you have a look at the percentages, yeah, the highest one there's United Arab Emirates. They have heaps of foreign workers, heaps and heaps. I went to Abu Dhabi a couple of years ago, and it's like 90% of the population are foreign-born workers. So and you see there in grey, that's Australia's percentage of people born overseas, 28% of people born overseas. And Saudi Arabia's the only real big country above us on that one. Right on. Here we go, one more map. This is net migration, yeah? So if it's green, people come to that country. If it's red, people leave that country. The darker red, the more people leave in that country. The brighter green or darker green, the more people move to that country. So if you have a look, places that get the most migrants: Australia, Canada, I want to say Oman or Yemen. No, I think it might be Oman. I don't know. And a little bit of Chile there. And where are people leaving from? The northern tip of South America, and quite a lot of Africa. People are moving out of Africa. But if you think about it, what do all the countries in red have in common? They're generally poorer countries. What do the countries in green have in common? They're generally richer countries. It's fairly obvious that if people can migrate from a poor country to a rich country, then they're going to do that. Okay, so continuing on with Australia's ethnic diversity compared. So here's a list of countries that all have 40+% migrants. So these are all countries where 40% of their population are either first generation migrants, i.e. they migrated themselves, or second generation, so that either they themselves are born overseas or they've got at least one parent born overseas. Australia, Canada, New Zealand and Switzerland, all wealthy countries. Interestingly, 3 of them speak English. I don't know if there's anything to that. Possibly. Here's some countries that have less than 5% first or second generation migrants: Korea, Japan, Hungary, Slovak Republic. Now that's interesting because they're not all poor countries. Some of those countries are quite xenophobic though, which means have a fear of foreigners. I know that Japan is relatively xenophobic. It's quite hard to break into Japanese culture if you're a foreigner, which is a shame because Japan and Japanese culture are amazing. If you haven't been there, go when you get the chance. It's sick. Now, so why do some countries have this very high migration level and others have very low migration level? Question. A lot of it's to do with their immigration policy. How welcoming are they to foreigners? To do with the humanitarian policy. So a lot of Australian migrants come here on humanitarian visas if they're refugees from war-torn countries, or they might be part of some ethnic minority that is prejudiced against in their home country, so they come to Australia. And we talked last lesson about why people might migrate and some examples. Remember, Syrian and Iranian refugees moved here due to war. What else did we have? Vietnamese refugees moved here after the end of the Vietnam War because their country had serious issues. We do see some economic migrants coming to Australia as well. I, for example, would classify myself as an economic migrant. The wages in Australia are way higher than in New Zealand, so that's why a lot of New Zealanders move to Australia. Now, the third reason why some countries have higher migration levels than others is to do with how flexible the national culture or ethnicity is seen. Is the country that you're moving to got a flexible national culture? Is it compatible with other cultures? So you could argue that Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Switzerland do have flexible national cultures. It's easier to make an ethnic hybrid between your country that you came from and the new one that you moved to. Right, here's another graph. It's from the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. The OECD is just a group of 30-odd rich countries. Now, I took a photo of this one. Sorry, I couldn't find it online, so it's a bit bodgy. But anyway, this shows you immigrants and native-born offspring of immigrants from 2013, or the most recent year they could find. Yeah. So on the left, so the higher up the total bar is the total percentage of people who are either foreign-born or native-born with foreign parents. Yeah. So the total height is the total amount of either first or second generation migrants. So Australia is third on that list. These are all just different ways of showing similar data, so that's why they all kind of show a similar thing but not the exact same thing. Yeah. So Australia's pretty far up there. The OECD average is there in brown. Yeah. So the countries on the right-hand side don't have strong multicultural policies, I guess you could say, and the ones on the left do. Just a random little infographic from the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics, showing a few things about Australia's diversity. What's interesting there to note? There you go, 45% of Australians were born overseas or have at least one parent who was. That's a huge amount. 85% of Australians agree multiculturalism has been good for Australia. So Australia's got a good multicultural policy, and it's a fairly popular policy. That's a high percentage of people who are in favour of a policy. I don't think you'd find many other policy areas where people all agree that much. Go team! Yo, this is the last slide of notes. Sorry, I know there have been quite a lot this lesson, so I'm going to give you a tiny amount of homework to make up for it. Okay. Right. So, how successful has Australian multiculturalism been? We've kind of talked about it a wee bit, and we're saying, yeah, it's been pretty successful. But success shouldn't just be measured in how many migrants you get. Yeah, you might have heaps of migrants, but they might all have a miserable life. So, you can measure the success of your multicultural policy by how successful those migrants are once they get to your country. Do they get jobs? Do they get educational opportunities? Australia is quite successful on those fronts. So yes, Australian multiculturalism is generally successful. There is some racism, no one's denying that, but way less than in other places. Yeah. So no country's perfect, and yes, we see racism every day in Australia, and that is a shame, but I would probably argue that racism is worse in quite a few other countries. Immigrants to Australia usually successfully mix Australian national culture with their previous ones. So in the classification system of that Australian sociologist Dr. Zevallos, she would say that most Australian migrants choose to be partly Australian, so they form an ethnic hybrid. They become an ethnic hybrid between their home nationality, ethnicity, and Australian ethnicity. Yeah. Right, here's a sweet as infographic about migration in Australia. About cultural diversity. Yeah, so 1 in 5 Australians have experienced race hate talk. That's sad. You can see where most migrants from Australia come from: UK, New Zealand, China, India, Vietnam. And as we saw a few lessons ago, the fastest growing location for migrants to Australia is China and India, which I'm going to show you in the next graph. Most of Australia's population growth comes from migration, as you see there, 60%. Yeah, and remember, the main source of economic growth in a country is population growth. Well, a lot of it is. So the fact that Australia's population has grown due to migration is good for the economy. Whether it's good for the environment, that's another question. But anyway, so yeah, check that. Australia is home to the world's oldest continuous culture. Nice. Okay, so this here is showing, this isn't total migrants, this is the change in migration levels from different countries from 2006 to 2011, yeah? So yes, the largest number of migrants already here are from the UK, but that's changing, and there's way more people coming from India and China. Why? Fairly obvious reason, I would say, is A, they are large countries, so there's heaps of people that can migrate. B, they're fairly close. C, we've already got quite a few Indian and Chinese people here, so I'm sure that they know that there's a Indian or Chinese community that they can form a part of when they get here. And obviously, D or E or whatever we're up to, Australia's got a successful multicultural policy, so people want to move here. And India and China are poorer countries in Australia, so if people move from those countries to here, they're probably going to have economic benefits flowing to them. Okay, this is the activity where I want you to interpret some graphs and infographics that we've seen. So have a look back at the graphs that you've seen, or if you can remember what they showed. I want you to write a 3+ so 3 or more sentence answer to this question. How does Australia's level of multiculturalism compare to other countries? And I want you to provide specific examples, yeah? So say, use actual numbers and name actual countries. So there's your activity. Yippee. Okay, today's video comes from the National Museum of Australia. It's a multicultural mosaic. Enjoy.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this series may contain images, voices, or names of deceased persons.
This episode, Multicultural Mosaic, is part of the series that deals with people. It begins in Sydney, the site of the first European settlement, and ends in Canberra, the site of Australia's national capital. We consider the immense contribution waves of immigrants have made to the making of a nation, and we question the purpose of closing our borders. Welcome to Sydney, the glittering state capital of New South Wales.
Sydney is Australia's largest city, and we've chosen this series' largest object from here. It's that unmistakable Australian icon, the Opera House.
And we've chosen the Opera House for three very special reasons. First of all, the site, where the Opera House actually stands. Here, on the edge of Port Jackson, near the entrance to Sydney Harbour, the waterway that laps all around this great city landscape. It's through the harbour's entrance, the Heads, that Sydney's first white immigrants came. Here, those first convict prisoners found landfall in Australia. So in a way, this is the place, the site of the first European settlement, where the story of immigration to this country really begins.
The second reason has to do with origins. For many people, the Opera House is the archetypal symbol of Australia, and you'll find it on key rings, tea towels, even snow domes in every tourist shop in Sydney. And yet its designer, Jan Utzon, was a Danish architect. Those distinctive white sails there found their inspiration, like so much of Australia's culture, into land oceans and oceans away. So this particular structure reminds us of the myriad different peoples who've contributed to building and the reimagining of Australia.
Thirdly and finally, there's the form this remarkable architectural statement takes. I guess everyone's got their own interpretation of the Opera House. Some people liken it to sails on Sydney Harbour, or sharks cutting through that water. Utzon described it as an orange broken open into segments. But you know, our favourite explanation of the Opera House's inspiration is the metaphor of waves. The waves that surround the shores of Sydney Harbour and encircle this great continent as a whole.
Those waves carried those first convicts to Australia, and they also remind us of the waves of different immigrants who have made this land their home. Those waves began, as Bruce just said, with Australia's British settlers. But even that first convict society was culturally diverse, made up of men and women from all across the British Isles, Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales, and beyond.
And even before the British invasion in 1788, there was a long history of journeys from Asia to Australia. From as early as the 1400s, fishermen from Makassar in modern-day Indonesia journeyed to northern Australia in regular seasonal migrations. They came to gather tripang, sea slug, a delicacy sold in Asian markets. We call them sojourners. The monsoon winds carried them to Australia and carried them home again with that valuable harvest.
It was that search for things of value that fueled the first mass migration from Asia to Australia. In the 1850s, tens of thousands of Chinese travelled south, all keen to find a fortune on the goldfields of eastern Australia. They were joined by Americans, Canadians, and people from all across Europe. As far as immigration was concerned, gold changed Australia overnight. from a place of exile for a colony of British convicts to a diverse and cosmopolitan community. Now everyone wanted to come here.
They wanted to come, but really they had to come. From the 1840s, these shores provided shelter. They provided sustenance for thousands fleeing the famine in Ireland. Again, Australian history has to be seen in a global context. The 19th century was a time of mass migration all the world over.
Australia may have been a British colony, but throughout the late 19th century, Afghan cameleers carried goods across the arid interior of Australia. Labourers from the Pacific Island worked the cane fields of Queensland. Japanese pearlers swam our waters in the tropical north, and miners and seamen came from one end of the globe to the other.
Those waves of migration continue. They continue after the Second World War as displaced men and women, refugees from all across Europe, are recruited to build the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. The Snowy, as we like to call it, remains this country's most ambitious engineering project. The energy that powered Australia came from the toil of Poles and Latvians, Italians, Greeks and Germans.
So in a way, Australia was always a multicultural society, and that cultural diversity is all too evident today. Melbourne is one of the world's largest Greek cities, second only to Athens. And the children and grandchildren of Turkish migrants brought out to work in factories of an expanding economy occupy key positions in government and industry. Our universities host students from hundreds of different countries, including thousands from China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore.
Australia is multicultural and we are multi-faith. This is St James. It's one of the oldest surviving churches in Sydney. This great building was consecrated in 1824 and religious services have been held here ever since. Back then, in colonial times, Christianity was the dominant faith of Australians. White Australians, that is. Christianity never supplanted the rich spiritual legacy of Aboriginal people. The stories of the dreaming explained every feature of this landscape. They offered laws to live by, they evoked a complex cosmology, and then, as now, transcended space and time.
Sydney, like the rest of Australia, is home to more than 100 different faiths. And not far from here, you'll find synagogues and mosques, chapels and temples, the great cathedrals of Christendom, right down to the small and humble places of worship and belief.
For countless thousands, Australia has proved a land of opportunity. People of different faiths, different cultures have built new lives here, often escaping poverty and persecution in the lands of their birth. But immigration isn't just a story of acceptance and success. Far, far from it.
Migrant labour was cheap labour. That's why government and private employers recruited overseas workers in the first place. Migrants worked the longest hours, in the worst jobs, for the poorest pay. And in many ways, they were marginalised by mainstream Australian society. Today, the trade union movement welcomes all workers to its ranks. In the 19th and much of the 20th century, so-called coloured labour was feared and resented. Foreign workers were seen as a threat to the wages and conditions won by white Australians.
And here you see a paradox in the history of our country. From long before the first fleet sailed into Sydney, Australia was a place of tremendous cultural diversity. Aboriginal Australia is an instance of that. Over 300 language groups, each unique and distinctive, spanning one end of the continent to the other. Now, we could have kept that rich and complex character. The new society we built here could have been open, tolerant, pluralistic. Instead, and here's the paradox, most colonial Australians define themselves as British. We strive to create what we called a white Australia, a society that turned its back on the world's oldest continuous civilization and that denied a simple statement of geography. Australia surely is a part of Asia.
You'll find a monument to white Australia here, right in the heart of Sydney. It's the Customs House. And from the mid-19th century, when the building construction began, to the early days of the Commonwealth, when the building was finally complete, this country made, enforced and refined the White Australia policy.
Those windows up there look out over the harbour, monitoring every ship as it comes into this bay. And back then, as today, not all those boats were welcome. The purpose of this building was to protect Australia's borders. Customs officials decided who would enter this country and when and how.
It's here and in customs houses like this one that Australia's restrictive immigration policies came into practice.
First came the poll tax. Now that's a charge of a staggering £10 per person. And it was levied on those Chinese gold seekers coming into Melbourne and into Sydney.
So to get around this, boatloads of Chinese landed in South Australia instead and walked to the Victorian goldfields. The journey took over 5 weeks and it's the largest single migration in modern Australia's history.
And then comes the dictation test. In 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia is created. And the very first legislation enacted by our very first national parliament is the Immigration Restriction Act. Under the Act, any immigrant to Australia could be forced to carry out a dictation test in any European language. Those tests were administered here, in this very building, and they had very little to do with linguistic aptitude. Egon Kisch, a political radical, was fluent in English, in French, in German. So what do customs officials do? They administer his test in Scottish Gaelic instead.
The Customs House controlled the flow of people into Australia and it checked the flow of ideas as well. Customs officials decided the books that Australians could read and the films they could watch. This was the place where art, people and politics were labelled foreign, obscene, undesirable. So in a way, this building was a bulwark against the outside world. It embodied the narrow, insular ideal of the White Australia policy.
Well, Australia's changed a great deal since then. And you can see that here, in this very building. Once the Customs House was about closing Australia's doors. Now it's one of Australia's liveliest public libraries. It's free, it's open to all. In 1973, a progressive Labor government formally abolished the White Australia policy. Today, immigrants and investment from Asia is welcomed rather than feared. And this country has proved itself one of the most successful and inclusive multicultural societies in the world. In Australia, around 20% of our population is born overseas. Compare that with 12% in the US, 13% in Britain. And unlike Britain or the US or so many countries in Europe, social diversity has come with a high degree of social cohesion. In Australia, we're living and we're learning together.
Our country has changed. The question is, have we changed enough? Some Australians still talk of turning back the boats, still fear those of different faiths or cultures to their own, still long for the inward-looking world embodied in this building. But many Australians would also say that's a world that belongs to Australia's past, not to its future.
We began this episode at the Opera House. We'll end it here in Canberra, beneath the windows of the National Museum of Australia. As you can see, the designers of the National Museum incorporated the Opera House into the very architecture of this building. And in that they were making a very powerful statement. You see, back in the 1970s, when the Opera House was built, it was seen by some as being too unusual, too confronting, too courageous. Today, it's part of the landscape of a modern, multicultural Australia, an Australia that welcomes and that celebrates difference and diversity.
These windows, like the Opera House that inspired them, look out on and engage the world. And embracing the whole world, not just a small, selective part of it, is surely at the heart of Australia's multicultural vision.
If you'd like to learn more about the issues raised in this episode, why not catch Susan Carland in conversation? This time, Susan's talking to Julian Burnside, QC, in a lecture at Monash University.
The reflection activity today, it's a sense poem. You probably did these when you were in primary school. I can't remember if we've already done one before, but hopefully you know what they are. So with the topic of multiculturalism, I want you to complete these 5 sentences. They don't have to be long. So when you think multiculturalism, what do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? What do you smell? And what do you taste? I'm not going to poke my tongue out, but you get the idea. So do a little sense poem to reflect on today's lesson. As promised, homework's not going to be very long. I want you to go to our vocab quiz. Remember, you should be spending 10-15 minutes on that. Oh yeah, because then you'll nail the exam, because you'll have heaps of great keywords and you'll be able to define them. So spend 15 minutes on that Quizlet quiz. If you are keen as a bean, as a machine, here's some bonus homework. All of those notes that we just took were from those pages of the Social Education Victoria Year 12, Unit 3 and 4 Sociology textbook. Read those pages, probably a good idea. And if you want, watch this video. It's another video, it's a little bit longer, maybe 15 minutes, about multicultural Australia. Wicked! Thank you very much for your attendance in this class, and don't forget to keep it real.